Welcome to Resilient Earth Radio, where we host speakers from the United States and around the world to talk about critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with my co-producers and co-hosts, Scott and Tree Mercer of the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study. We talk about nature-based economies that help rebalance Earth and raise awareness about the value of whales, elephants, mangroves, seagrass, the deep seas, waterways, and forests. This awareness could lead to new laws, policies, and procedures to help protect these valuable resources and encourage economies around them to replace the existing exploitation of oceans, forests, and animals. The music for the show is Castle by the Sea from international composer Eric Alleman of the Sea Ranch in Sonoma County, California. In this episode, we speak with Washington, D.C.'s Ocean Foundation Senior Fellow Richard Charter once again, this time about the scope and impact of President Biden's recent ban on offshore oil and natural gas leasing. On January 6, 2025, President Biden took action to protect the entire U.S. East Coast, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and California, and additional portions of the Northern Bering Sea in Alaska from future oil and natural gas leasing. In protecting more than 625 million acres of the U.S. ocean from offshore drilling, President Biden is ensuring that these regions can remain healthy and safe from the risk of oil spills resulting from development that would do little, if anything, to meet the nation's energy needs. As Richard says in this episode during our discussion on this historic action, we all know that oil is incompatible with those natural-based economies, and Alaska is a prime example of a sustainable, natural resource-based economy. Richard talks about how the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, OCSA, was written so that a president is enabled to permanently protect areas of the ocean. Interestingly, it was Republican President Nixon who was the first to use this same legal mechanism, and he used it in California, this Section 12A of the OCSA. He did that to protect the waters off the California shores of Santa Barbara after the disastrous oil spill of 1969. That blowout led to the release of 4 million gallons of crude oil into the Pacific and along 100 miles of California coastline. It killed thousands of seabirds and countless more marine mammals and fish and other ocean life. The 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill released 11 million gallons of crude oil in Alaska's Prince William Sound. To this date, it still has not fully recovered. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon exploded in the Gulf of Mexico and spewed oil for 3 months. 134 million gallons of crude oil was released into the waters and along the coastlines before the damaged well was capped. We'll talk about that as well as key findings from decades of ocean research in our national marine protected areas, which shows why protecting our oceans is so important to our ability to continue living on this planet. That and more coming up on Resilient Earth Radio. Why don't you discuss, first of all, what this ban covers, and then we can get into how foolproof it is to keep from being reverted back to where it was.
Well, in stunning, amazingly good news for everyone who cares about the ocean, President Biden has permanently protected 625 million acres of federal waters off the entire Pacific coast, the Atlantic coast, and Florida's Gulf Coast, and Alaska's Northern Bering Sea. The method that he used to do this is permanent, it's irreversible, and it has proven to be legally defensible in the past, and in fact was once used by President Trump himself to protect the South Atlantic coast. So we don't think this is going away, and this is probably the most stunning conservation decision since Teddy Roosevelt and the creation of national parks.
How does this differ from how state waters are protected?
Well, in California, the state controls waters out from the shoreline to 3 miles offshore. Other states have a little bit more, but in California, it's 3 miles of state waters. And in state waters, our state legislature some years ago enacted a moratorium on any new activity in state waters. So we're in pretty good shape in California as far as very near shore drilling, but 3 miles out to federal waters is not very far. It's not a matter of visibility, it's how fast an oil spill can travel on nearshore ocean currents. That could be ashore in a matter of an hour.
We here in California experienced that over half a century ago in Santa Barbara.
Correct. What we learned in Santa Barbara, we had been told for many years by the oil and gas industry that it was a safe activity. There's nothing to worry about. There could never be a spill. And what happened was they lost control of Platform A in the Santa Barbara Channel when Union Oil was drilling there. And they literally blew out a section of seafloor near the rig. In other words, it wasn't controllable anymore. They had actually fractured the seabed so that oil was just flowing freely. And actually, that prompted then President Richard Nixon to fly to California, take a look at the mess, which extended about 100 miles along the Santa Barbara coastline. And he was the first one to ever use this same legal mechanism. It's called Section 12 of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, Section 12A. He used it to permanently protect an area of federal waters right in front of the city of Santa Barbara. So this is actually a Republican mechanism for protecting the coast. And it was triggered by the Santa Barbara blowout in 1969. So this is not new. We've seen much worse things since the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico, which nothing succeeded in terms of oil industry strategies to shut that in. We just had 4 years ago an offshore oil accident, a pipeline fractured off the coast of Long Beach. So we're no stranger to offshore oil accidents in California.
We saw some of the information that just came out from the Washington Post regarding representatives from Alaska and what they would like to do there. So, how would you address some of that news where they talk about a sympathetic incoming president who they want to do an executive order on Alaskan drilling?
The problem is in Alaska that the economy is so interwoven with commercial fishing and even sport fishing to some degree, but commercial fishery is a huge part of the Alaskan economy, not just for local communities, but for the whole state. And in fact, balance of payments of U.S. shows up Alaska fisheries. So President Obama, when he was in office, permanently protected Bristol Bay using this same legislative mechanism, and that's the richest sockeye salmon fishery on the planet. Well received by governors and officials in Alaska of both parties, and of course saved the fishing industry. The current area that has been done by President Biden is the North Bering Sea, and the Northern Bering Sea is not really an area considered to have any oil potential of significance. So I'm not sure quite why the Alaska delegation is doing what they're doing because A, it hurts their state to undo this if they could, and we don't think they can. And B, it doesn't add any oil anywhere near the terminus of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline terminal in Valdez. And of course, in Prince William Sound, there's still tar buried in the sediments from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which of course was oil from the North Slope being shipped to the lower 48. So Alaska has a very bad feeling about oil in their waters. So I think the senator from Alaska may be a little out of tune with his state.
Scott, you had something to say about this too.
Yeah, hi, Richard. The Bering Sea, as you know, is the major feeding ground for the gray whales during the summer.
Correct.
The other two, the Beaufort and Chukchi. I mean, I know you know that the snow crab population has just unraveled.
Yeah.
And it's come back slightly. And NOAA is going to open up a limited commercial operation I think, to try to save a few jobs. That to me seems like a real tightrope act to get the population of Bering crabs enough. It's come back slightly, they say, and the effort is to give a few people involved in the snow crab industry jobs. So they allow a small take, and if that causes a second collapse of this little recovery, that's how sensitive that is. But that snow crab population, when that collapsed, thousands of jobs went with it. The Alaskan congressional delegation, like so many of them, are so afraid to say no to Trump that they're going to have to hear no from their voters. And that's going to take a grassroots operation up there. They also have permafrost problems, the tourism and the roads. I was just telling Leanne that a graduate this year from Point Arena High School, as a gift, his father and grandfather took him halibut fishing up there for a couple of weeks. So the area does rely heavily on the tourism in that area. It's going to take that kind of effort from citizens to tell the politicians no, so that they may get enough gumption to tell Trump no.
Well,
And
Alaska's offshore waters are just one example. They're like the poster child of what happens when you over-extract a limited natural resource, in this case, fisheries, and then try to bring it back incrementally, which takes a huge bureaucratic process, of course, fishery management councils and all that. And then you get it almost back, and then the financial interests that lost their jobs when that fishery collapsed, they want the protection lifted. And if that's done too soon, you lose the whole thing. And of course, overarching issue is oil, because we all know that oil is incompatible with those kinds of precious, sustainable, natural resource-based economies. And Alaska is a prime example of a sustainable natural resource economy that became addicted to oil money, because when the Trans-Alaska Pipeline that deal was cut, each Alaskan got some income from North Slope oil, and that was supposed to buy off their concerns. And that's the kind of deals that go down in Washington. But in this case, we're waiting to see what Alaska does. In other words, these protections that were put in place by President Biden, I think they all stand together or they all sink separately. In other words, we are tied now to the future of Alaska here on the Mendocino-Sonoma coast, because if they lose their protection, that will probably be part of an effort by the incoming Trump administration that could cost us our protection here now, permanent protection that I'm sure people in Mendocino County remember 48 years ago. A movement began here in Mendocino County that grew into first a national movement and then a global movement that resulted in this protection that we're talking about. I remember Bonnie Raitt coming, she had a house in Mendocino County. She did a concert to benefit the funds for the nonprofits that were beginning the process of protecting this coast from offshore drilling.
We do not want to see our protections taken away, but it's going to be a challenge, I would think, with a Republican Congress in place. This incoming president makes a claim that he's going to increase energy dominance. Aren't we already producing record amounts of energy right now, Richard?
Absolutely. With the onset of the Biden administration policies, the U.S. oil and gas production is at record highs. In a way, it's like the natural resources in Alaska. Can you take enough, or can you take too much and destroy the system, and then you get nothing? Ohio is just opening their state parks to fracking, because fracking has reached its peak and is now on its way out. But the oil production in the U.S. is not the problem. And adding these fragile areas offshore back into the mix for offshore drillers is not going to bring down oil prices, because oil prices are determined at the global level, not by some little tiny pool of oil off of Mendocino Village. They're determined in the global marketplace. And we're getting, as we speak, a horrific lesson about the true costs of the climate crisis. We've been ignoring it as a society at the request of the oil industry, who spent a lot of money trying to convince everybody that there is no climate crisis. But we're watching the most significant blowtorch climate-fueled wildfire destroy huge parts of Los Angeles right now. And so we kind of need to listen to the planet as we confront Trump's effort to reopen this coast. We got permanent protection. We're going to hold on to it. Our own congressman here, Jared Huffman, who is now the ranking minority on the House Natural Resources Committee, which would have to be the on-ramp for any kind of effort to lift this in Congress, he called this Trump-proof. The protection granted by Biden is Trump-proof, and I believe it is. I believe that there's always a lot of chest beating by this particular, respect for the presidency, yes. Mr. Trump became president the first time. He said he was going to open 90% of the Outer Continental Shelf to offshore drilling. That was one of the first things he said. And then his Secretary of Interior, Ryan Zinke, quickly said, except for Florida. So he doesn't always follow through, nor is he able to follow through in Florida, because if Florida winds up being open to offshore drilling, that could easily tip the balance in the House of Representatives so that the Democrats would control the House. And the chair of House Natural Resources, most likely, no guarantees, the chair would probably be our own Congressman Jared Huffman. The Trump administration is playing with the balance of the Congress with this issue. It's what we call in Washington a third rail issue. You got the metro rapid transit trains, and there's a 900-volt rail that powers it. And offshore drilling over the last 35 years on Capitol Hill has always been known as a bipartisan issue and a third rail issue. You touch it and you get fried, especially in Florida.
Talk about the portion of the ocean around the United States, the western and central portion of the Gulf of Mexico, how that is not part of this ban.
In the central and western Gulf of Mexico, there are very large offshore oil production facilities. Many of them emulate the technology of Deepwater Horizon. It's a very deep ocean. It's a very deep well into a very hot, high pressure oil zone. Again, the technology of the blowout preventers and the fail-safe mechanisms are rudimentary still in some cases, but those are like a cash cow to the major oil companies. They just produce and produce and produce and produce. That's why even the oil industry has not been particularly urgent about getting a hold of Northern California or Washington and Oregon. We just had a lease sale in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge this week. There were no bidders. These places that are more remote and more expensive to develop, and where there's incredible impediments posed by local governments who have banned onshore facilities for federal offshore drilling here in California. Mendocino voters approved one of those. We have 26 of them in California, put together by Save Our Shores down in Santa Cruz in the 80s. Marin just added one a couple of years ago. These ban onshore facilities for offshore oil. People don't remember, but Manchester, little town of Manchester, scenic town on the Mendocino coast, was supposed to be an onshore facility for processing offshore oil and gas, like a mini refinery in Manchester. Think about that. Sonoma County banned it on the ballot. Mendocino banned it on the ballot. Other cities and counties banned it either on the ballot or by a vote of the people, and gave their citizens either the right to vote if something like that's proposed or outright banned it. That serves as a detriment. It's a chilling effect on any bidding, because what oil company is going to buy a lease if they can't get anything ashore?
Right.
So we have layers of protection here, and they'd have a hell of a time getting across state waters with the state moratorium. So I think California has more layers of protection than any other state, actually. And of course, we have 3 existing and soon to be a 4th. Well, actually, we have up here 3 existing national marine sanctuaries, a 4th at Channel Islands, and we're about to have a new one at Shumash National Marine Sanctuary off of San Luis Obispo County, we've done a lot of layers of protection here because we knew they would eventually try to come for this coast.
Manchester is right at the edge of the Greater Farallones Marine Protected Area that goes
Correct.
down to the Cordell Bank.
Correct. And
Yeah.
ironically, you mentioned Point Arena, the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, when it was expanded, it took a few years to expand it. During the time we were expanding it, Trump was making threats about that when he came in. We had, of course, at the heart of it is the Farallon Islands. And expanding it, we roughly doubled the size. We took the northern boundary from Bodega Bay and extended it all the way up to Point Arena, just north of Point Arena. The reason we did that is because there was interest by the oil industry right off of Point Arena in oil. And so we made sure to include that in the sanctuary. The sanctuary bans federal offshore leasing. It bans any disturbance of the seabed for pipelines or anything like that. But north of Point Arena, I mean, if you want to look at Mendocino as a messenger, if you will, north of Point Arena, all the way to the Oregon border, actually all the way to the Canadian border, has been unprotected from offshore drilling. Once the annual yearly moratorium that we renewed for 27 consecutive years in Congress, once that expired with the end of the second Bush administration, there has been no protection of federal waters off of Mendocino until Biden's enacted this permanent ban this week.
And what mechanism that you were talking about earlier, is that what is going to help keep this from being overturned? We're concerned about if it's fragile or if it's really strong.
It is really strong and it's been tested. It's been tested in court and it's survived this particular law. We don't know what methodology President Trump might take to try to overturn this. He's made a lot of semi-coherent statements about an executive order, about unbanning it on day one, was his, I think, favorite quote. He's looking at ways to do it, but the problem is none of them will work. This is locked in. And the reason it's locked in is because Section 12A of the OCS Lands Act, the way it is written, it says a president is enabled to permanently protect areas of the ocean, but it doesn't have anything about taking it away. It just enables a president to permanently protect an area. So there is not in current federal law a way to undo it. This was like a one-way street. And what President Trump is talking about is making a U-turn on a one-way street to see what happens. I don't think he's going to get anything but a head-on collision with a bipartisan consensus that's existed in the House. I mean, this is not a new issue, and these are not new areas. These areas represent the bipartisan consensus that Congress, year after year, for 27 years, protected these same areas 1 year at a time by banning the Interior Department from expending money for leasing in these areas, the lower 48 areas, not Alaska, but these areas in the lower 48 have a very long, very bipartisan congressional history. And if you zoom in on Florida, it is ironic, but off the Gulf Coast of Florida, off the what's called the Eastern Gulf of Mexico planning area, there is a mission critical military space use conflict, as it's called. There is a Eglin Air Force Base. We have nothing like it anywhere else in the U.S. It is essential to all U.S. military activity. And that's why you see Republicans in Florida fighting to hang on to what Biden did this week. Ironically, it is a military question for Florida, along with, of course, the whole Florida economy. You don't need to look very far to see that if Florida lost its coastline, its economy is toast. And of course, the thing about Florida is, yes, they're Republicans, but yes, they care about their coast. And the voters, the public in Florida, voted to amend their constitution not that many years ago to ban offshore drilling in their state waters permanently. So it's political suicide to try to undo this if you're elected by the public in Florida.
Do you know what, if any, leases there might be right now have not yet been developed that might be in these new protected areas? And if
Be-
so, what could happen?
because we maintain the annual offshore drilling moratorium for 27 years in these areas, there are no pending new leases in these areas. They've been protected 1 year at a time. The Bush presidency meant a presidential executive deferral for these areas. Both Presidents Bush protected these areas. So there's nothing in progress. You know, the oil industry plans about 40 years ahead. And then once they get a lease, it takes them about 5 to 7 years to actually build something. So there's nothing in motion. This is not taking something away from the industry that was half built, not happening in these areas. That's just not here.
Yeah, Richard, in southern Maine, there was a marine protected area off of Platts Bank, which is well, that area is kind of offshore Portland and Kennebunk.
Correct.
And this was during the Trump's first administration. He swooped in and took that away. I'm not sure how he did that.
A different set of mechanisms. In other words, yes, there are probably ways he could find to weaken a state marine protected area or some fishery related protected area. Although surprisingly, in his first administration, President Trump was very sympathetic to, for example, the lobster fishermen, you know, Cape Cod type fisheries. He's been an ally of large fishing interests. You will remember that here, when we were dealing with the expansion of the Greater Farallon Marine Sanctuary, Trump came in and he said he was going to institute a review of any new marine sanctuaries that were done in a certain period of time prior to him taking office. So he put together a review of the new part of the Greater Farallon Marine Sanctuary from Bodega Bay to Point Arena. It was official. And he directed his Secretary of Commerce to conduct that review. And we all commented on it and said, don't do it. It's crazy. It's a fishery. It's the most sensitive part of our upwelling system. And his Secretary of Commerce, you know, he was in office for 4 years. He got busy doing other things and he never touched it. He never touched it. So we've been through this all hat and no cattle kind of talk before. And there really is no other part of the planet, you know, globally, I mean, that has so many layers of protection because this is a global treasure. It's a UNESCO International Biosphere Reserve laid on top of a national marine sanctuary, now laid on top of a permanent offshore drilling ban. People who are in ocean planning come from all over the world when they're looking at marine protected areas that they're considering in their own backyard, and they come here to study what we've done on this coast. This is the most carefully protected piece of ocean anywhere in the world. So he's going after the heart of the heart, if you will, the core values of ocean protection. And frankly, I have a feeling he's in for a big surprise.
A lot of data is being collected, of course, by, like, say, NOAA's ships, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And we talked with some of the people that are doing that. And can you tell us some of the findings that they're gathering that show the importance of all these marine protected areas and the layers of coverage that we've got?
Well, three things. One, most recently, the Greater Farallon Marine Sanctuary has been doing a lot of research on deep water coral, very deep ocean coral, which are sometimes surrounded by some very unusual deep sea critters that don't even have names yet, but may ultimately have utility to humanity for medical purposes. Secondly, in terms of climate warming, the entire coastline within the boundaries of the Greater Farallon Marine Sanctuary has been monitored for decades, section by section. I mean, incrementally, little pieces of the coast monitored relative to ecosystem change observable as a relation to climate change. In other words, we know that there are things like the warm blob off of the mouth of the Golden Gate, where warmer water changes the ecosystem, but all the way up and down this coast, which is this upwelling system that is so amazing and powers all of these living systems that are part of our lives and underpin our economy here. they've been studied. And so we know a lot about how each little part of this coast is changing with the climate. And it is changing. Different species are moving along this coast. We probably know more about climate warming impacts on the coast here than anywhere else because it's been so well studied. And finally, the upwelling system itself, which brings the nutrient-rich water from the deep up to the surface, where the sun then shines on the biological mat, if you will, moves along the coast. And we know a lot more than we have ever known before about how that supports things like the largest seabird colonies in the U.S. on the Farallon Islands, and how that supports these haul-out areas and rookeries for marine mammals, and why the whales are commuting up and down this coast. This is a center, if you will, for scientific understanding of the effects of climate on our oceans, but also the ocean is a moderating impact on climate. The ocean is absorbing maybe too much carbon. It's too good at it, but it is, in fact, moderating the impact of fossil fuel consumption by absorbing carbon into the ocean itself, taking it to the deep ocean. And when it does that, it kind of gets it out of our way. And one of the ironic things that's been happening lately, and Trump, I think, supports it, the oil industry wants to sequester carbon under the seabed. Carbon, very expensive, very wasteful of energy to try to extract it from industrial processes, smokestacks, and pump it under the seabed and hide the carbon. Sounds crazy, but a lot of the hearings in Washington lately have had to do with carbon sequestration and getting federal funding to do that. So we're waiting to see where Trump comes down on that, because the oil industry is more interested in making money than anything else. They're not interested in taking care of local economies or jobs. They want money in Houston, and they want to make sure that they don't miss any opportunities for federal funding. And of course, the carbon sequestration has been targeted for federal subsidy.
Richard, it does seem like it comes down to sometimes the energy production versus the environment and the protection of that environment. How do you address people who are on the side of business and we need to do this to produce energy because our country needs it, yet at the same time got to have the protections in place for the environment? What are some of your thoughts on those issues?
That is a false narrative that's been promoted by the oil industry after focus groups told them that it would work. Same oil industry that promoted the fact that climate change was not going to be a result of burning fossil fuels. So the idea that you have to sacrifice the environment to prop up oil and gas to sustain the economy is simply proven to be not true. This is an incredibly energy intensive industry. They burn oil to search for it, to get ready to bid. They burned energy in the course of developing it. They burned energy in the course of transporting it to a refinery. Refineries are notoriously wasteful because they burn part of the hydrocarbons to refine it into fossil fuels like oil or avgas. And every step is wasteful, and it's harming the climate at every step in a huge way, big contributor to climate warming. And then you blow it out the tailpipe of a conventional fossil fueled automobile or out the smokestack of a factory. So every step pollutes, not just pollutes the water, which is visible and we see it. Everybody says, oh, dead birds. In the Gulf of Mexico, they had so much oil floating around, they tried to burn it on the surface of the ocean. It didn't really get rid of it. It just made it less visible. We just had a study come out this week, ironically, the same day that Biden protected the Outer Continental Shelf, 625 million acre withdrawals. A study came out of the Gulf of Mexico on dolphins and whales and other species that said that the damage by the Deepwater Horizon is still going on today in 2025. It's still happening. And so, people don't forget, and we have state marine protected areas. that are designed to each one serve as a restoration zone that could seed new life for the surrounding area. If we ever got hit by an oil spill here, we have these areas that we hope we have picked carefully enough to serve as a seed bank to restore the surrounding coast. And if we bring back the sea otter, 1,800 sea otters got organized and stopped James Watt when he was Secretary of Interior from drilling very close to shore on the coast of Big Sur. Literally, it was the sea otter that stopped James Watt's offshore drilling plan for Big Sur. They are very effective because A, they sop up oil too well and they die. You get 10% of an otter oiled and the fur sticks to the skin and they die of hypothermia. And they're a charismatic species. And there are efforts, they probably won't be concluded in my lifetime, but this was a sea otter heaven at one time. And the reason we're having these urchin barrens off our coast because of the loss of the kelp forests is directly connected to the Russians coming here, subjugating the natives to kill all the sea otters. So we're restoring this ecosystem. We're not further damaging it. And so everything that Trump is talking about is contrary to core values of this entire region, including our economy.
And Scott, you and Tree have done a lot of studying on the sea otter too.
Yeah, I started with that in 74 and continued that on for several years until I moved back east. The way sea otters died in Prince William Sound was absolutely torturous. They were heard shrieking in pain as their livers were coming apart while they were still alive because they were right down in the water in the oil slicks. That got a lot of attention at the time. That was about as inhumane as you could get with any of the animals that died there. You were mentioning the lobster industry, and Trump's interested in that. You remember how small Maine is, less than 1 million people. And he likes to collect his votes, the electoral votes. Maine only has a couple, but when he was told that the income of the economic value of Maine was wrapped up in the lobster industry is a couple $1 million more than there are voters in the state. He became very interested then. He had no idea what Platts Bank was or what it was being used for. I think he thought it was probably a major lobstering ground, but that's what his interests are, is economic.
And there's something I wanted to go back to, a statement from the ocean industry's president about this ban from Biden, where he called it politically motivated, not science driven, and damaging for consumers. What would you say to him that it's politically motivated?
Well, we've had some of the most respected economists in the country looking at this and what the contribution to the global oil market effect on the global oil market might be of removing these areas from production forever, permanent production. And it's zilch. The global market is so huge that you basically cannot affect it by drilling in the areas that have been set aside for protection. It's determined by other factors that are a much larger curtailment of production would be required to incrementally move the needle on oil prices. And then when have you ever seen the beneficent oil industry lower their prices? They would just pack in anything that happened in a way that got them more money, not less. So we don't believe that they can demonstrate, the oil industry, that protecting these areas is going to somehow affect price at the pump. It won't. The numbers just aren't there.
Right. When I moved back east in 77 or 78, the idea was that do the offshore drilling around George's Bank, which was absolutely ridiculous, the number one fishing grounds in the world. And oceanography community, like at the University of New Hampshire and the University of Maine, were saying that there's a counterclockwise circulation of waters in the Gulf of Maine, starting with the inside border of George's Bank, where the deep water begins. And the oil industry was retorting with, well, there's no reliable data. Well, Jimmy Carter got elected, and he started the CTAP program, Cetacean and Turtle Assessment Program, and that was the first big project I worked on. There were no sea otters in New England, and never were. So I got involved with the marine mammal community there at that time, which was whales and seals based out of College of the Atlantic. And I got involved with the CTAP program, and we showed that there's actually a lot of marine mammal activity, of the migratory activity off of George's Bank and well offshore there, going into the deep, deep water. And then there was data, and the whole program gets scrapped. Their ideas, I mean, for offshore drilling get scrapped. Well, what goes into the Gulf of Maine with that counter circulation of oil currents just goes around and around and around. There's no exit out. And then it includes the channels on the other end, around the Canadian end of the Georges Bank, where water pours in from the Labrador Current and so forth. So when there was data, then the oil company waved the white flag and said, we're not going to bother with this. When they come up with there's no data, all you do is show them some. And
You're absolutely right. The night the Deepwater Horizon went off, I got a call at about 3 a.m., woke me up, said there's a blowout on a rig called the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. We need to know where it's going to go. What do the currents look like? So I called up a friend of mine who studies what are called the loop currents in the Gulf. They're circular motion of water that can be like a superhighway of transporting oil. And the concern was that the Deepwater Horizon oil would rather rapidly go to the Gulf Coast of Florida, where a lot of very wealthy people have very expensive houses. So I called up my friend, woke him up. It was 3:30 here, and I said, he does modeling for the sport fishing industry. And I said, where's it going? And he said, not yet. It will be entrapped around the wellhead at Deepwater Horizon for a short period of time. And the loop currents were a little bit southeast of where the blowout was. Deepwater Horizon went on, of course, for months, and I was winding up on CNN trying to explain it to the world. Ed Markey, congressman from New England, who was concerned about exactly what you're talking about, the fishery up there, he convinced the Congress to require that the wellhead photo of the leaking Deepwater Horizon be made available to the media. So every time the news would cover the Deepwater Horizon, there'd be this little box down in the corner whenever I was on TV or anybody else. He was on TV, Leon Panetta was on TV. There was the wellhead leaking all of this huge volume of oil. I mean, this was not an inconsequential leak, and there was no way to shut it in. They tried, remember, a dunce cap. They tried golf ball type stuff to pump it to concrete. The blowout preventer didn't respond to the remote. And finally, one day I got home and there was an email from someone that says, why don't we use a nuclear bomb to try to shut in the Deepwater Horizon? And I thought, oh my God, we're that desperate, because of course that could open the whole reservoir to the Gulf of Mexico, and we could still be having the Deepwater Horizon go on today.
Right.
And what became a big issue, of course, in the Gulf was when the spill did reach Florida Gulf Coast, and there were tar balls the size of a basketball washing up on the beaches of southern Florida. The concern was that it was going to go around through the Florida Keys and get into the current up the East Coast and hit all the East Coast states. And I remember that day when it was kind of lingering, the residual oil off the Keys of Florida. It didn't wind up doing it. The connectivity you're talking about is huge. I mean, an oil spill could travel thousands of miles. And it gets more toxic, not less toxic, if you put dispersant on it. And it gets more toxic, not less toxic, when the sun shines on it. That is why we're pretty confident that the Florida senators, the Florida governor, the Florida House delegation, the probability that they will support an effort to remove permanent protection from offshore drilling to the eastern Gulf of Mexico off the Gulf Coast of Florida is just not there. It's too fresh in their mind. The Deepwater Horizon created post-traumatic stress, not just for me, but people in Florida who lost their business because they couldn't hold their breath until the oil went away. They remember. They know. They know that the economy of a state is based on a clean coast environment. And if you lose that, you have nothing. Nobody will come there because the beaches are covered with tar, and people who work in the response to an oil spill wind up getting cancer. This is all documented after Exxon Valdez. And now I don't think that today they would even use the same dispersant, because we know the dispersant just makes it worse. It absorbs into the ecosystem more rapidly and more deeply with the chemical dispersant. So if the oil industry can't clean it up, they have no right to drill. They don't have the right to come into these communities and put them at risk. Deepwater Horizon eventually affected 8 or 9 states. in measurably significant ways. And so the oil industry is not in charge of this country yet. It might be after the inauguration, and we'll deal with that. I mean, the fact is that it's a very finely balanced Congress. The House of Representatives is like a hanging on a razor edge, and nothing can happen without a consensus in the House. It just can't. So I am confident this is, in fact, Trump proof. It's going to hang on.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. And I wanted to also touch on deep sea mining because it just raises up some of the issues there as well of disturbing the seafloor and how far things travel from sound to sediment. Our second episode here at Resilient Earth was with you talking about deep sea mining and the documentary that the Ocean Foundation and you had produced with others to bring up the perils of deep sea mining. So I think of that. I also think of windmills around all of these shores too, and what perils might lie there. So I wanted you to touch on some of those things, Richard.
Well, briefly, deep sea mining right now revolves around two things. One, in the Pacific, extending from nearly Hawaii to basically Central America, is called the Clarion Fracture Zone. And as the U.S. converts to non-fossil fuel transportation, it needs more what are called critical minerals, primarily zinc, chromium, what are called the rare earths, and nickel in particular. And these can be found in nodules laid across the seafloor for thousands of miles, which are slightly radioactive when they're handled on the ships. They actually expose the workers to a level of radioactivity that's not permissible. And these are pulled up and then they're stripped from the seabed by giant remote control bulldozers and brought to the surface and ground up to become the metals for electric cars or wind generators or the next generation of nuclear weapons. So we did a film called Defend the Deep, which is very alarming. And we didn't mean it for it to be alarming, but there's no way to do it without being alarming because at every step, deep sea mining puts pollution into the ocean. Scraping up the seabed creates a plume that can travel 1,000 miles. Bringing it to the surface, the excess is ground up and dumped in the ocean, creating a surface plume. And these are what are called three-dimensional plumes. In other words, there's no technology for cleaning up a three-dimensional spill in the ocean. At least oil spills float on the surface. This stuff travels throughout the mid-current. It's not going to be benign. It affects every layer of ecosystem in the ocean, and it is not a safe technology. So we have a video which is online now at thedeepmovie.org. Thedeepmovie.org. It's a 20-minute documentary to begin to introduce this issue because we were getting a lot of questions about it. And of course, the questions are germane because the ocean, as I mentioned earlier, absorbs a lot of the excess carbon. This interferes with the ability of the ocean to absorb carbon. It not only pollutes the ocean, it messes up the ocean's ability to save us. So we're looking at that linked to the offshore wind tracks that have already been leased, of course, off the Humboldt coast, and the effort to bring offshore wind substations to our coast, which are built by the oil industry, and cables that would come down offshore subsea from Humboldt Bay to the Bay Area to theoretically bring electricity from Humboldt Bay to markets in the Bay Area and the impact those will have on our marine protected areas. Some of those cables will have to run through national marine sanctuaries. And then we had a proposal at Fort Ross last year to build what's called a pump storage facility that would suck water out of the ocean right off the Fort Ross State Park, pump it up to the top of Seaview Ridge between Cazadero and Annapolis, and then run it back down the hill to generate electricity when it was needed. This attracted the attention of our state and local officials, and we managed to convince FERC, who governs offshore issues, for FERC to reject the permit. That would have destroyed Port Ross State Historic Park. It was literally right on top of the park. It's illegal under the sanctuary regulations to take seawater out of the sanctuary. It's illegal to put it back into the sanctuary. And so that got stopped. But again, it could come back. I mean, there are secondary impacts to offshore wind that we're paying very close attention to. Humboldt Bay is going to be converted into a large industrial port. And if that happens, it could be attractive for a offshore mining industry. Back in the 80s, we fought a proposal called Gorda Ridge, which was to strip mine the seabed off of northern Mendocino County up into Oregon for minerals by bulldozing them off the top of the surface. And these hydrothermal vents, undersea hot springs, deposit these same minerals. And so Humboldt Bay could become, and if it gets improved in the way the wind industry's tried to do it, an attractive area for the offshore mining industry. So all these things are connected. Like everything else in the ocean, everything's connected and not always in a good way.
Yeah, that is something that we were talking about too with Captain Paul Watson was the interconnectedness of things. And it would seem like, and I'm no expert, but it took millions of years and ongoing carbon sequestration down on the seabed floor, and disturbing that does not seem like a good thing to do.
Well, the deep ocean ecosystem is not well understood. And we keep finding new organisms and new systems there that are totally unique to the very deep water. One thing that humanity has been interested in the deep ocean is medical applications. A lot of people don't know it, but the tests that we've taken for COVID were developed from a very deep water sponge. It doesn't mean you have to go harvest all of the sponges to get the medicine. You replicate it once you understand it. There are indications that some cancers are going to respond to or are already responding in the laboratory to deep ocean ecosystem-based critters. And so we're about to destroy through subsea mining what could be the thing that saves our lives later. In other words, there's not really a mechanism to do this gently. You have to tear things up on the seabed in order to get the metals we are looking at. And of course, with Elon Musk in charge of an agency that we talk about enlightened self-interest, he builds Tesla cars, and this is what they need. I have a feeling we're going to be soon in a confrontation with him. And of course, then people need to think about expanded offshore wind, which will come down from Eureka, and next will be on the Mendocino coast. So there's no free lunch. In other words, what has been lost, I think, in the debate lately about what to save, what's left of nature, and whether we can save it, is painless energy conservation and creative strategies to use energy more efficiently. Nobody wants to talk about that. They want to talk about artificial intelligence, and it's supposed to double our electrical demand. At some point, we exceed the carrying capacity of the planet. If you have friends who live in the outlying areas of Los Angeles today, I think they will tell you we may have exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet. The Los Angeles basin always had the Santa Ana winds. They were there before people. It's the geography, it's the dynamics of the way meteorological phenomena interact with the landscape. There was never enough water for so many houses in the LA basin until we gave them, or they took, Northern California rivers from Shasta Dam on down. So a lot of people moved into an uninhabitable area, and I don't know that there's a surprise in seeing what's happening to LA today. I mean, it's horrific, but it has a message, and the message is be very careful about not exceeding the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, because it not only will destroy your economy, which of course we know offshore drilling would do here, but it can kill you. Mother Nature bats last, and the ecosystem damage will bite you, and it is. So at some point, as a species, we need to learn to listen more carefully, I believe, to the planet, and it will guide us. There are survival strategies inherent in some of these very tough messages, and they don't involve drilling the most sensitive waters off the U.S. coastline ever.
What words do you have for people listening who are concerned about these critical issues, and what positive actions could they take to make a difference?
Well, number one, don't take Trump too seriously. Take him very seriously what he says, but pay close attention to what he does. Because, yes, as I said earlier, we need to respect the office of the presidency. I mean, that's one of the things that holds our country together. There will be an opportunity in 2 years to flip the House. We should really think seriously about doing that. We should support Congressman Jared Huffman, not just because of the key role he plays in these decisions in the House Natural Resources Committee, where everything has got across his desk, but make sure there's other congressional people. Mr. LaMalfa from up in the Chico area, he's been put in charge of an energy task force in the Congress by the Republicans. There are people who need to hear other than just our friends. In other words, not just the already convinced. When you're in Congress, I've watched them for decades. You're always worried about your next election campaign. Where's the money going to come from? Do you have the votes? We need to start shaking this whole state on this issue of offshore drilling. And we can, and we have before. And it's an issue that originated in Mendocino and Sonoma Coast, right here in these, back when you had to put postcards on the store counters in the grocery. There was no internet. Back when you went to a Bonnie Raitt concert in Ukiah and raised money, this is the heart of the offshore drilling protection, and we deserve to keep it. We will keep it. And the third thing is our national marine sanctuaries may need to be defended again. For some reason, the Trump administration has an uncanny ability to go for the most sensitive parts of the ocean. That would be here. We have access to the media. We have generally friendly local elected officials. We might think of ways we could strengthen our Measure A and our similar onshore facilities bans, strengthen them. We just did that in Sonoma County to give them more teeth so that we can get through the next 4 years. It's not a long time, but it's a dangerous time. And we need to make sure we get through this next 4 years because we've got people who are not friends of the environment are going to be in charge. And the only thing that's going to restrict their ability to do very bad things is if we punch back hard and politically and smart. If we do that, we'll hold on to what we have.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for coming back on Resilient Earth radio and podcast to talk about these important issues and what some of the actions are that are being taken. And Scott and Tree, if you have any last words that you'd like to say or ask.
There's much appreciation for everything you've discussed today. I think you've cleared up a lot of questions that we've all had, and we appreciate all the work you do, Richard.
I appreciate everything that every activist who cares about the ocean has done in the last 48 years that I've had the privilege to work on this issue. This is a collective effort. It is not any one person.
Exactly.
I think it was Margaret Mead that said the only thing that can really make a difference is a small, dedicated group of people. I think you are that force for good.
Thanks for listening to Resilient Earth Radio, where we talk about critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram and wherever you get your podcasts. The music for the show is Castle by the Sea from international composer Eric Alleman of the Sea Ranch in Sonoma County, California.